Okay, before you even begin applying the five forces framework, it's important to calculate the historical profitability of the industry. And again, what we're doing here is using the five forces framework to understand historical performance of a company rather than project it into the future immediately. In other words, we're using this five forces approach as a framework for understanding historical performance. Now, the idea here is that, or the underlying premise that I'm using to organize this approach here, is that the real return on invested capital in any business unit or any single industry corporation, the real financial performance is driven both by its industry structure and its competitive position. So let's say you're looking at a company that had a 9% return on assets in a particular business unit. This data that I've got here is from an example from the beer industry. This is from Coors beer before it was acquired some years ago here. It had a 9% real return on invested capital, or 9% return on assets. Now you look at that and you think, immediately you might think, if you were on the board of directors, that 9% looks pretty good. The economy is only returning about a 4% return on assets right now. Compared to the economy, 9% looks excellent. But a second look might lead you to a different conclusion. The average for beer companies at the time that these numbers were pulled together was an 11% return on assets. So if you average together South African breweries, Anheuser-Busch, which was at that point independent, Miller, and so on, all the different beer companies, you would get an 11% return on assets, which means that the beer industry is attractive. It's outperforming the economic average by 7%. By definition, then, Coors in this example has a competitive disadvantage. It's underperforming its peer group in this example by 2%. In other words, Coors has got a 9% return because it's in an attractive industry, not because it has a competitive advantage. It has a competitive disadvantage here. So the goal here of industry analysis is to understand why the beer industry is a good business to be in. So we're going to drive our conclusion that the industry is attractive from the numbers here. Now, it turns out that in some industries, no matter what measure of performance you use, the numbers are consistent. ROE, ROA, and ROS are consistent. For example, in the pharmaceutical or drug industry, return on equity historically was something like 21%. And this compares to an economic average of about 11.5%. This looks pretty good. The pharmaceutical industry with a 21% return on equity is well above that 11.5% economic average, which is the criteria, the threshold for determining whether an industry is attractive. Other attractive industries are food and kindred products, chemicals and allied products, and even fabricated metal products here. All of them have returns on equity above that criteria of 11% economic average here. Underperforming industries would be, for example, textile mill products, or even, for example, the construction of personal computers, which has had historically quite low performance here. So return on equity above 11.5% by definition would be attractive here. Below that number, tied to that number or below, would be unattractive. Returns on assets, the average has been about 4% over the last few years. Drug industry, again, quite attractive by that criteria as well. Food and kindred products, breakfast cereals, branded consumer packaged goods in general tend to be attractive industries with returns on assets above that 4% criterion. Textile mills, auto production, and so on would be below that level. Return on sales, the average in the economy right now is about 5%. So as you can see here, 13% drug industry average is well above that threshold of 5% here. Now, as you consider industry attractiveness, it's important to evaluate which of these criterion you're going to use, because they don't always deliver a consistent message about an industry average profitability here. Now, what I'm about to say is going to be developed in the finance curriculum more extensively, but just to give you an introduction here to the ways in which these numbers are connected here, we know from the DuPont ratio, which you're studying in finance, that return on equity equals return on sales times asset turnover times financial leverage here. If we look more consistently at this in terms of the tautology here. You can see net income over shareholders' equity, which is what defines return on equity here. So that's what return on equity is by definition, equals return on sales, or net income over sales, multiplied by asset turnover here, and multiplied in turn by financial leverage. You can see that this last equation, or this last ratio, is equal to financial leverage by considering that assets here equals shareholders' equity plus liabilities here. So if we decompose this ratio into those components here, what we're going to get is that this equals 1 plus liabilities over shareholders' equity, which is a measure of the debt or the leverage, the financial leverage that an organization has. And you can see this is an identity because if we canceled out across this equation here, you would get a tautology, net income over shareholders' equity equal to net income over shareholders' equity. Now, I advocate that unless you have some other reason for choosing an alternative here, that we think about return on assets. See, if we just kept this alive here to get net income over assets, this is return on assets here, this part of the equation. Return on assets times financial leverage here equals ROE. Return on assets, because it reflects the operating strategy of a business unit in its particular businesses. In other words, in its industry. So I advocate using return on assets, all else equal, as your criterion for whether an industry is attractive or not. And again, the reason why is because the five forces framework is not really designed to dig into the financial strategy of the client or the company that you're looking at. It's designed to focus you on the operating strategy of the particular business unit you're studying in an individual company here. So return on assets is the best measure for capturing that. Now, in some situations, you can't get your hands on return on assets. You know, you don't have the information, or there's something unusual about the company's asset turnover, such as, for example, the assets are not operating assets, they're inventory or other current assets. In that instance, you might use return on sales as your measure of performance. Many organizations, such as in retail, transportation, and so on, are holding a lot of their assets in inventory here. So again, I told you before, the average for the economy is about 5% return on assets. So you can use that as a benchmark if asset turnover is unusual in the industry that you're studying. Another anomaly comes up in financial services. In financial services, the assets that are not being held in the organization, that are being held in the organization, are not operating assets, they're financial assets. So for example, you know, if I take out a mortgage from a bank, that mortgage is booked as an asset of the bank. And the news is that the bank can't use the financial, it's not using that mortgage as an operating asset to create value through its day-to-day operations and its competitive environment here. It can't use that principle in a conventional sense. So you might use return on equity for financial institutions. And as I mentioned before, 11.5% is the threshold for the economy. It's about 11.5% ROE on average among publicly traded firms. Return on assets of 4%. So bottom line, I suggest you use return on assets unless there's some reason for you to use return on sales or return on equity. Sometimes you can't get the numbers on return on assets or return on equity. You have to turn to return on sales. The bottom line is to pick a single metric that you're going to use to identify whether or not you're studying an attractive or an unattractive industry.